everybody. Today you find me in the driver's seat of a Series 1 Lotus Elise Sport 160, a special version of an already very special car. And I happen to think this might be just about the best Lotus Elise ever made. Why is that? Well, find out in today's episode of JayEmm on Cars. The first clue I got that this was a particularly remarkable car is that this is in fact the second time I've driven a Sport 160. The last time was up in Scotland a couple of years ago, and as I'll talk about in a minute, there are a few differences between that one and this. However, for both owners, they have each owned the car twice. They had it, sold it, and then decided they had to have it back. And in the case of this car's owner, James, he said that if he sells it, it'll be the last Elise he ever owns, because he believes he'll never be able to beat it. Well, must be good then, mustn't it? It really is. So what actually is a Sport 160? Well, the Series 1 Lotus Elise landed back in 1995 and caused a storm as soon as the public laid eyes on it. In fact, I am told by those who were there, it wasn't really the car itself that got all the attention. Instead, it was the bonded aluminium chassis that sat under it. And Lotus, very wisely, put one of those on display. And that is what got people talking. It weighs itself only 68 kilos, but is very strong. And I've heard a few different stories as to exactly how Lotus arrived at building this chassis. But the truth is, it doesn't matter, because it was brilliant. They then combined that with a Rover K-Series engine, which I know to many people is just about the worst engine ever made. But to those who know it, actually, it's got a lot going for it. Yes, I know, in the Rorschach test, if you see a K-Series, someone will then say head gasket, but put that aside. It's a very clever thing, very compact, very potent, and it suits a car like this down to the ground. All in, the original Elise weighed something in the order of around 700 kilos. I've heard people say it was actually slightly under, but I think in reality, none of them actually were ever quite that svelte. Regardless, that was still a light enough car to mean that the original 118 horsepower 1.8 litre engine was more than quick enough. For some. But to many, the original Elise just never had the fireworks they required, and so, fairly soon on, Lotus started working on solutions to this problem. The first idea they had was something called the Sprint, a fairly extreme car with a cut-down windscreen and closer really to the original concept for the Elise, but they realised it was going to be too expensive and wasn't ever going to work. Instead, what they came out with was something called the Sport 190, which is actually a very curious car because, officially speaking, Lotus never built an Elise Sport 190. Instead, much like the Aston Martin Vantage V600 of the day, what it was a conversion kit. Sorry, 3-point turn hill start torture test, and it's going terribly, terribly badly. The car has basically no steering lock. Putting the gearbox in reverse is horrid. Visibility is excellent, I'll give it that, even with this crash bar in here. Anyway, yeah, that wasn't good. So, much like that old Aston Martin, the Sport 190 wasn't a car that you really just bought. Instead, what you did was either took your existing Elise to Lotus, more accurately Lotus Special Vehicle Operations, later rebranded as Lotus Sport, or you could buy one from the factory new, tick the box for a Sport 190, they would then build your car as a normal Elise with 118 horsepower, drive it over to Special Operations, and they would convert it. And this was quite the job. The engine's internals, head were changed, power rose from the 118 to 190, as you might imagine. That engine being known as the VHPD, very high performance derivative. The car even got lighter body panels, and apparently a few of them were carbon. This was an expensive thing, and technically speaking, sort of road legal, but it didn't even have a catalytic converter in it, and so it wasn't ever going to be really a long-term solution. That then arrived in the form of the Sport 135, which took some of the ethos of the really track-orientated 190. So you had uprated Coney suspension, a little bit more power from the engine, which in stage 2 guys made 135 horses, and a few other tweaks throughout. Both the 190 and the 135, which I've actually driven and also quite enjoyed, came out in 1998. But in 1999, the Sport 135 was then effectively replaced by the Elise S, which now had a 143 horsepower engine, but with VVC. That's the variable valve timing that Rover had, and they themselves later used on some of their cars, like for example my MG ZR. That also followed much the same formula as the Sport 135. You had close ratio gearbox, the uprated suspension, etc, etc. However, then in 2000, the Sport 160 landed. Keeping up? And that was effectively the successor to the Sport 135, so had again the same uprated suspension. There may have been subtle differences, but the intent was still the same: lower, firmer, slightly more track orientated. The engine now made, as you might have guessed it, 160 horsepower, 131 pounds-feet of torque, but unlike the Elise S, it did without the variable valve timing. It did have the intake plenum from a VVC, why I don't know, but it also had different cams, valve train. The block was as original, but the exhaust was a little fruity with a Motorsport catalytic converter. The airbox was bespoke, and it was a rather spicy thing. So much so that the original 50 were made under SVA, single vehicle approval, which for those unfamiliar is the same process you'd go through if you had a kit car. And the reason you do that is because the regulations aren't quite as stringent as they are for a more series production vehicle. But as there was great demand for the Sport 160, they sold only something like 85 of the 135 and over 300 of the 160, they then eventually did get it type approved. But in order to meet said approval, they had to make some changes. So a secondary airbox was fitted, a larger catalytic converter installed. The exhaust in this apparently is actually basically the same as a 340R. And though you may not believe me from either the look or the sound of it, this is the original exhaust. And the last 160 that I drove is one of those later cars with a better behaved ECU, slightly more tractable. Oh, interesting. That's curious. The car just died on me. Anyway, hope that doesn't happen again. So the last 160 that I drove was one of those later type-approved cars. This one is one of the earlier SVA ones. And in order to maintain the ethos of the original, James hasn't even fitted the later drivability kit that Lotus offered. So it's still running its original map and everything, meaning that at idle it's a nice, rorty, angry-sounding little thing. It has that lumpy tick over that promises something quite special. And this, of course, being a now near 25-year-old Lotus, there have also been a few modifications made to it over the years, including, perhaps most obviously, the fitment of this roll bar here, which is an original and genuine accessory. I see 190s with them. It also has this removable and very nice and tiny little steering wheel. The paintwork is Verde Scandal, a Fiat colour, apparently. Just 7 of these cars were painted in this colour here in Britain, and this one has to be the most famous of them all. In fact, it might be the most famous 160 full stop, because not only did it feature in Evo magazine way back in 2000, the photos were then licensed by Lotus themselves. So, if you've ever seen a picture of an Elise 160 in a sort of official setting, there's a good chance it's this exact car. And that is part of the reason why James has held onto it now for 15 years. And the other part, of course, is how it drives. So beyond the wheel and the roll cage, what else has changed? The airbox is a little bit different. I'm pretty sure I spotted a catch can in the back there, though I may be mistaken. It also has non-standard suspension, which to be honest is, well, just about the case for almost every Elise of this age. Many people go with nitrons. James tried those, but he didn't like the idea of it because he found they were just too stiff. And for him, one of the things that makes an Elise, and indeed any Lotus, so special is the way that it rides. And I was so happy when he said that, because I've driven a few of these now where people fit aftermarket suspension and it just makes the car stiff. Needlessly so, it just ruins the whole experience. A Lotus should flow with the road, and this really, really does. This is a very demanding piece of test road, and this is currently flowing down it far better than the E46 BMW M3 that I drove not that long ago. Now, you've probably detected some unusual noises coming from this car. Part of them will be the exhaust, which is, I promise, standard. The others will be coming from the gearbox, which is not. So by default, these didn't actually even have the close ratio box of the 135 and the S. They got a regular one. James decided to fit a full close ratio straight cut set gearbox to this. And that turned out to be a very bad idea because it limited the top speed to just 110 mile an hour and it made quite the racket. So he went back to the drawing board and then redid the gearbox with 1 through 4 as close ratios and 5 as a helically cut regular gear, which is much longer. You can tell that round town it doesn't like maintaining a constant speed. It's a lumpy little so-and-so. Yeah, go on, you devil. And you know what, actually, it kind of works. I've never, to be honest, been a huge fan of this gearbox, which I think is a PG1, also Rover. Though the action itself is quite nice. The lever doesn't really have much travel in it at all, and I know some people like that, including myself on occasion, but it's just a bit indistinct. A bit disconcerting, really. The car does also have the ability to flat shift, so back there, I know it sounded like I was bouncing into the rev limiter, once I probably was. Actually, you just leave the throttle where it is, put the clutch down, pull, and it does its own thing. Not sure I'm fond of that. I mean, I don't trust myself, if I'm being entirely honest. The noise this thing makes is just glorious. I think you'd get very tired of it over a long journey, but then you can kind of say the same for, well, most Elises, to be honest. They're just not natural long-distance cruisers, but are you surprised by that? The other thing I should say is that, though it, yes, does have a very impressive power-to-weight ratio, exactly how much this one weighs, I don't know, but let's imagine with the extra scaffolding and stuff in it, let's be pessimistic, let's say 800 kilos. Well, in theory, it's got about the same power-to-weight ratio as that E46 M3 that I drove, but it's not as quick as that, or it certainly doesn't feel as quick as that. Right, its turning circle is really, really shockingly poor, and I'm going to hope that car is not turning where I am, because... right, let's get you over. Right, I mean, I'm grateful that the visibility... Oh, you are coming down here. Right, okay. Let's get out of the way. Oh, incidentally, the nickname for this car is the Toxic Frog, because it's bright green on the outside, red on the inside. These are not the original chairs. In order to accommodate the harnesses, which were necessary because of the A-frame, they had to be changed because the factory ones don't have the holes for harnesses, and there was no space left when you put the A-frame in for the original 3-pointers. I actually do like these harnesses. They're Schrott ones. They're very, very nice, easy to adjust, very comfortable. But yeah, it's not actually that quick, but that's fine, because what it is masses and masses and masses of fun. And this means that even though the actual overall limits of the chassis aren't as high as you may think, they're still pretty high, it communicates to you so clearly that you're never in any doubt, you're never in any worry. You don't mind the fact it hasn't got traction control, stability control, or anything else. It's not a problem. It's just about you, the car, the road, and nothing else. And that, to me, is what not just a sports car, but a Lotus in particular, should always be about.
Okay, well, then we'll...
Lotus are a funny thing because you get a lot of people that have never experienced one and they think they know what they're all about. They look at an Elise and they go, yeah, rattle box, harsh, firm riding, horrid little thing. No, not at all. A well set up Elise is a gorgeous, beautiful thing. Really refined, very comfortable cosseting. That's just the engine on this one. But honestly, I think this might be just about the best set up Lotus Elise I have ever driven. Now, I'm a little bit weird, you know this already, I think, but I've never felt like the Series 1 is the prettiest of the Elises. In fact, I've never really considered it a pretty car, but every year I think it does get a little bit better looking. I myself had a Series 2, a 111R with the 190 horsepower Toyota engine. And that was a mistake because, well, when you were absolutely caning it, that was a lot of fun. But when you weren't, it was a bit frustrating, really. Also, the pedals just didn't work quite right. Oh, this incidentally has an uprated pedal box because it's now got uprated AP brakes as well, and that was necessary to be able to balance and bias them correctly. But this thing, if you're into the business, the art of driving, oh, it's so flipping good. It just flows with the road and the steering. Oh, I've not mentioned that yet, have I? But yeah, there's a reason this is the benchmark for brilliant steering. The weighting is sensational, of course. It's unassisted. There's not even a brake servo in this, so the brake pedal is also nice and heavy. I can heel and toe in this, which I can't do in the Series 3 XEs I've currently got on the driveway. Not mine. If you want to know about that, there's videos on it. The roof down just makes a huge difference as well. I'm doing like, well, not even the speed limit. And it doesn't matter, I'm having a whale of a time. Oh yeah, the response to that engine is perfect. And if you want to get the absolute best from it, yeah, you do need to rev it, you do need to push it, but that's no chore whatsoever. Yeah, really need to push those brakes hard if you want to do anything, but they talk back to you, they're lovely. They're really, really nice. Oh, you lumpy little bastard. And yeah, the interior is simple and basic and everything. This has been retrimmed in Alcantara. That's why they did the drivability kit. Yeah, to sort that out. But you just use the clutch a lot and you basically just try not to let it be at low RPM.